Okay, so let's look at the Ntfs permission on the finance folder. So in order to see the Ntfs permission, you right click, go to properties, and you click on the tab, the third one from the left, security. Okay. So here we see that we have some um, groups configured or added under the group or username. Here's where we will add users and groups who we need to access or who we need to assign this security or Ntfs permissions. Ntfs, if you're wondering, means the Nt means new technology, and Fs mean file system. So new technology file system. Now this new technology has been around since the days of Nt, which is a couple decades ago. So it's no longer new, but it has been used and tested and works really, really well. So the name has been kept, and it's normally referred to as when you're assigning security access, a file and folder sharing and access in Windows. So the name Ntfs means new technology file system. So let's have a look and see our administrators, what access has been given to the administrators group. So notice that the administrator, this is actually a group account because it's represented by the icon that shows the image of like two people. You can also assign access to individual users by selecting the user. If you click on edit, you can actually look for a user and in the system and add the user account only. So it doesn't apply, this Ntfs permission can be applied either to a single user account or a group account. It's always a good idea to create groups and add the permissions to the group accounts, and all the users that are members of that group will actually receive the permissions that you assign to the group. So it makes administrative overhead a lot more easy, as opposed to just assigning rights and access or Ntfs permissions to individual groups. Because if you assign it to an individual, it means that if you have 5 or 6 individuals or user accounts that require the same access, you will have to do it for each and every account. So putting those users in a group, then you basically assign the permissions to the group, and that permissions that you assign will be handed down to all the users that are members of that group. So let's have a look at the administrator group, and you see that we have here a number of different types of permissions, starting from full control, modify, read and execute, list, folder contents, and read. Now notice that it's actually grayed out, so we can't make any change to the administrator or the users. Now we'll come to that as to why it's actually grayed out. That is something called inheritable permissions. Because this folder by default it's set to inherit the permissions from the parent folder. So this finance folder is actually a subfolder of a folder called data, right? So we see here the main folder or parent folder is called data, and in data I have subfolders. So that's the one I'm looking at, subfolders finance. In order to remove this option, for example, if you want to remove the users group, if you don't want this users group to be here, but you just want another specific group or user to have access to it, and you want to remove users, you will have to remove the inheritable permissions. But we'll do that we'll do that step in another lab. For now, I'm going to go ahead and explain to you what these permissions mean. So starting with full control mean it gives full control to this folder and all the subfolders that will be created under this one folder. So we're looking at the finance folder. So the permissions that you see applied here will be applied to this folder and all the contents that comes under this folder. So it means that any subfolder now that you create under the finance, any subfolder or any file that you actually store under this finance folder will automatically inherit all of these permissions unless you specifically remove the inheritable permissions from the folder. But we'll get to that in another lab. So full control means that this particular group administrator has full control over this folder and all the subfolders. So full control will, you notice here, once you select full control, it automatically gives the other access, the other NTFS permissions to the folder or to the group. Full controls mean that you can modify, you can read and execute, you can list folder contents, and you can read everything in here. So full control means the user or any user that belongs to the administrator group can change the permissions of this folder. They have the access, they have the right to change the permission of the folder. They can perform any modification, meaning that they can delete any files and folder under this folder, including this folder itself. So for example, if an administrator wants to, that has full control on this folder, they can completely delete this folder and all the contents in it. They can read and execute, meaning that they can open up the folder, they can open any document within any subfolder, and they'll be able to read it. And if there's an executable file, it means that they can run that executable file as well. The list folder contents, meaning that they can, that's really a limited access that allows a user to just list the contents in the folder. But it doesn't, but list folder content doesn't mean that you can read and write to it. List folder contents mean that you can just view all of the files and folders listed under this directory or under this share. And read means that you can read the contents that is in a document. So you can open any file and you can read the contents. Now let's go to the very bottom of this permission, which is write. So there's also a special permission, and we'll get to that in another session. But the write permission allows a user to be able to open a file and modify the contents. Okay, so being able to, if a user needs access to a file and they want to be able to modify a file, for example, if you're looking at an Excel file, and the user should be able to make changes to the file, meaning that they can make entries, they can delete entries in the file, they can add entries to the file, they will need the write permission, read permission, and list folder contents. Now, certain permissions that you add or certain permissions that you assign to a folder or a file will actually automatically enable other permissions. For example, if a user is given the access to read the contents of a file, they will automatically be given the list folder contents. Why? Because the list folder contents is the very base permission that you can actually assign to a folder or a file. Because if the user has been denied the list folder contents, they will not be able to list or view anything in that share. So if they can't do that, it means that they will not be able to read it, they will not be able to write to it. So the very base the very base permission that must be given is the list folder contents. If a user needs to just list the folder contents and be able to read the contents of files, then they will need to be given the list folder contents and the read permissions as well. So they will have to get the list folder contents and read permissions. If the user now needs to be able to view and make changes to a file, they must be given the list folder contents, the read, and the write. So if you're assigning access to a folder or a file and you select the write option, the write permissions, automatically the read and list folder permissions will be assigned automatically. If you need to give the user permission to read and execute, meaning that you want them to be able to execute a program or to run a program that is executable, for example, an ESI or an MSI or a .exe file, and that file is stored within this finance folder, then for that user to actually access and execute that file or run that program, they must be given the execute permission as well. Modify permissions, what does that do? Modify permissions, when you select the modify permissions, automatically the user will be given read and execute, list folder permissions, write, and read. The modify will give you all of the below permissions plus the option to delete contents under the finance folder. So any subfolder and file, if the user is given the modify permissions, the modify Ntfs permissions for finance, that user will be able to create subfolders under there, plus they will be able to delete files and folders within the finance folder or within that parent folder called finance. The full control now, the difference between the full control and the modify permission, Ntfs permission, is that full control will allow the user to make changes to the permission. So a user who has been given full control, say in our example finance, that user can actually will be able to modify these Ntfs permissions. It means that the user can come on this folder and remove any group or user that has access to the share or that has access to this file or folders.